Welcome, everybody, to the On the Blue Line podcast with Wayne Mulder. I am happy to be back with you again, and I am the host, Wayne Mulder. That's right, you guessed it. I hope you all are having a good week. I hope that everyone is staying safe out there, and I hope everyone's ready for another morning roll call. In here, this is the short, usually less than 30 minutes, unless I become long-winded, podcast where I talk about something that is on my heart, something that I want to share with you, and possibly something actionable, occasionally a news story, occasionally several news stories, or something that I want to drive home. If you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to the last few podcasts, I encourage you to do so. 3 weeks ago, we had came back after a pretty long hiatus. I encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast where I explained the beginnings of On the Blue Line, why we were absent for a year, and what we are doing now. So I hope that you will check that podcast out. And then last week, I was able to read a portion, a small chapter from my small book called How the Law Enforcement Career Makes You Cynical. And then more importantly, which is not part of the title, but more importantly, quote, what you can do about it, because that is the important part. So I hope that you will check that out. We've got 2 weeks left. The book is free, no strings attached for you up until September 1st. So if you are interested in reading it, if you do think it would be beneficial, if you have that problem where you're looking around and you can't think of anybody who possibly could be cynical, like you're sitting there, you're staring in the mirror, and you're like, I cannot for the life of me think of anybody cynical. I'm sure you have a friend that is cynical if they've been in law enforcement for any length of time. So just think about it, and maybe you'll get it for them and then, read it so that you could share the information with them later. Just an idea. So I hope you'll check that out. Go to the website, ontheblueline.com. It's right on the homepage for the next 2 weeks, and then I'm going to be moving some things around. But for the next 2 weeks, it's right there on the homepage. Click on it. You do have to provide an email address. As with all email lists, you could unsubscribe if for some reason it pains you to get emails from On the Blue Line, but I hope that you won't. And then you can get the book for free. After September 1st, it will only be available as a Kindle ebook. It only costs a few dollars, and it is available there now if you would rather do that and not have to give your email address. So that is enough of that. This week, I'm actually, if you did listen to pretty much what our mission is and what I was talking about with the podcast a couple weeks ago, I talked about that we really have two goals, and that's empowering law enforcement officers in their personal lives and then educating the public on the realities of law enforcement. This week is going to fall into that second category. I want to go over a few things. I'm not going to go in really deep on a couple of these, and you're going to understand why I'm saying that here in just a moment. But I want to go over a few things that have come up in recent weeks and then drive a point home that will hopefully help our non-law enforcement listeners. And then, of course, as always, if you have a differing thought or a differing opinion, I hope that you will join us on social, and I would love to hear it. Or if you love the concept, then I would love to hear that as well. So let's get into this. So first and foremost, and I'm actually going to do this in a little bit different order than I had sat down to do it, I want to first go to the Uvalde shooting. Now, a lot of things have been said about this. This is not going to go deep into that at all. That is not my intent with this, because you're going to see where I'm going with this in just a moment. Rather, I just want to point out this horrific response. There were certainly some failures, right? I'm not saying everything was a failure. There's been some that I've watched online give their opinions on it, and pretty much they have laid out that everybody, all 400 plus officers or whatever that got there were, cowards, and they throw out these crazy things. That's not where I'm at with any of this, but there are definitely some lessons, and there are definitely some major failures that probably that possibly led to the loss of life and so forth. But one of the major ones, and I think anyone in law enforcement sees it right away, is at some point they decided to move away from what is accepted training now and treating this like an active shooter situation, and it became a barricaded subject situation in their mind. And I'm not sure why that was. I'll be honest with you, I've not done the level of research that I would want to do to get deep into this. But definitely a tragedy that occurred, and definitely some failures and lessons that we absolutely can never make again. So, and on all sorts of fronts when it comes to that. But What I really want to point out is, so here's a horrible situation. This gunman goes into the school. Law enforcement is there. In fact, the first officers, I believe it's within minutes, actually enter the school when they go down the hallway and there is some engagement that takes place. They get shot at, then they fall back, and then again, for whatever reason, this becomes in their mind a barricaded subject situation, and that's not what it was. But that's what occurs, and you see this on video, and then time elapses, and it's like 40-some plus minutes later when heavily armed, there's officers that show up that actually have rifles and they actually have shields, and there's still no engagement that takes place, and then it's well over an hour before they finally enter into there and stop the threat effectively. So there's two takeaways, just in very broad strokes. And again, the purpose of this is not to discuss the Uvalde shooting. In fact, that's not even going to be the name of this episode. I may go into it at a different time once I can get through all of the research I want to do, so that I can make some really big points on, first of all, what was the disconnect into it becoming a barricaded subject situation in their minds? And then secondly, what happened with the leadership, because there is clearly a leadership failure on so many levels of at least what I'm seeing from the outside looking in. And again, as always, I want to say that I don't have any inside information. I don't know anybody down there, and I always want to give the benefit of the doubt to anybody, and that's true in any of these situations with any of these organizations, that unlike the legacy media, I do not want to jump to conclusions. Rather, I want to wait for all the facts and make sure that we fully understand everything before we make a determination or any thoughts on that. So for the purpose of today, this episode deals with the fact that citizens are the actual first responders. That's the point I kind of want to drive home. So in this horrible situation, where you have pretty much an hour that goes by before law enforcement takes action to neutralize the threat. There is action that's taken prior to that, but before the action to neutralize the threat. So that leads to the question, well, how long does it take for law enforcement to get to a scene? How long does it take? If I call 911, when are the cops coming, right? That becomes the question. Well, I'm going to go over a few articles here, but on average, what's interesting is most of the articles, it's hard to find current statistics. In fact, the Bureau of Criminal Justice statistics, most of them are from like 2012. It's hard to find current statistics from the federal government on this, and I've searched a few different locations, and we'll keep searching. What you find are a lot of businesses that are in some sort of security, alarms, those kind of things. They're the ones that are putting out a lot of these statistics. So take everything with a grain of salt. But I will say that they are at least quoting back to some of the FBI's figures from the early 2000s, 2012, as well as from the Bureau of Criminal Justice statistics. In their findings, police response times had an average of 3 minutes to over 15 minutes. And then they broke this down. They go a little bit further as to what has to do with why it takes so long, and then what factors are played in there. So the 3 factors that determine response time, we all know this if you're in law enforcement: number of incoming calls at the time of your call, number of officers available to respond, and the number of officers needed to respond to your specific situation. I would argue also what your specific situation is, getting kind of back to the active shooter situation that I started this discussion about. And then it goes down to looking at various cities across the country and their average response times to different calls. I'm going to have a link in the show notes so you can look at these specifically and kind of get some idea. I thought it was really interesting. These figures actually come from the Bureau of Justice statistics in 2008. So crimes of violence, right? Within 5 minutes, they were there 28.3% of the time on a national level. 33.5% of the time, 11 minutes to 1 hour. And what's really mind-boggling is longer than a day and 0.4%. Now, it makes sense if you get into the weeds on this a little bit, because they're putting crimes of violence. They're also adding like simple assault and aggravated assault. So that could essentially be a little more than a threats type situation with the suspect gone. So it is possible that a call like that would hold, depending on what else is going on, and that it very well, 2 people get in some sort of confrontation at a store, One of them says, I'm going to punch you in the nose, and he leaves, and you have no suspect information, and so forth. It could hold. It could go to the desk at some agencies. It's not a priority call at that moment. So, but it is interesting that under the crimes of violence category, that there are some that are longer than a day before the law enforcement got there. Property crimes, longer than a day, 1.9%. Within 5 minutes, 12.8%. The greatest amount for property crimes is 11 minutes to 1 hour. Most of them fall in there, which is 47.8%. And that includes household burglaries were in that same thing. 46.9% were in the window of 11 minutes to 1 hour. And then thefts, it was in that 48% as well. So kind of interesting when you look at that from a specific crime type. When you look at active shooter situations, it looks like the average by year was in that 3-minute range. That's where that number kind of comes from, as far as how long it takes for police to get there. It varied. There were quite a large disparity depending on which type of case they were responding to. The other thing that's very interesting, and I have this article in there in the show notes from the FBI, is the event resolution prior to police arriving and after police arrived on scene. And so that is kind of interesting on where they're looking at all of the active shooter situations during this time period and how many of them resolved, how many of them the suspect left. The smallest number was 5 out of the incidents that they looked at in this one. So by far the smallest was the subject leaving so essentially the event begins, and then one of two options, either the attacker stops or the victim stopped the attacker. 34, the attacker stopped, and then in 29 of those 34, they committed suicide. Only 5 of them left. The victim stopped attacker in 17. So in roughly half of them, the victim stopped the attacker. And then in 14 of them, they subdued them, and 3 of them, they shot them. So I found that kind of interesting. And then once police arrived, then it kind of splits again. So out of 53 cases when the police arose and the incident was still going on, 21 of them, the attacker stopped, and 32, the police stopped the attacker. And then you can follow it down from there. So it's interesting when we look at these situations, how long it takes for law enforcement to get there and how long it takes for law enforcement to get it set up and then take action on whatever the situation may be. Now, this isn't in any way meant to be anti-law enforcement. There is a reality to how these calls come in, right? So you call 911, it goes to a dispatch center. There are some things happening right now with like live dispatch where law enforcement is getting the information in real time, which will hopefully shrink some of these response times. I know there are some local agencies that are using it, and there's some other technology out there. So things are probably only going to get better, and law enforcement's going to be able to get there faster. But no matter what, there's always some delay. There's always a moment between when you, the caller, have to share information with law enforcement. So the chances of them being there in seconds, short of them being there already, so like the situations where maybe an officer's inside the 7-Eleven and then something unfolds at the 7-Eleven, then yeah, absolutely, they're there immediately and they can deal with whatever the situation may be. But in most cases, when you call the cops, there's some delay between when you provide the information and when law enforcement is going to be able to arrive and take care of whatever the situation may be. That being said, I then want to talk about this story that you've probably heard happened last month, and it was the one out of Indiana with the mall killer. What's amazing is these details. So law enforcement, Greenwood Police Chief James Ison, he had to issue a correction because when he first had the press conference, he said that this young man in Indiana, he was able to neutralize the mall perpetrator within 2 minutes, is what he said originally. Well, what they do is they look at the surveillance footage, and the surveillance footage shows the killer entered the mall shortly before 5 p.m. He spent about an hour in the bathroom before he starts firing at patrons in the Greenwood Park Mall food court. Well, police said he exited the bathroom at 5:56:48 and was neutralized by 5:57:03. 15 seconds. What's even more impressive is that he fired 10 shots from his handgun from a distance of 40 yards, and police said the killer was shot 8 times, and none of them were self-inflicted gunshot wounds. So 8 out of 10 from 40 yards in 15 seconds. That is impressive. And that is somebody who has trained with his firearm. I guarantee you. In fact, police-involved shootings typically don't have those kind of numbers. And these are guys that have to qualify every year. And girls that have to qualify every year. So it's just amazing what he did. In fact, quoting, his actions were nothing short of heroic. He engaged the gunman from quite a distance with a handgun, was very proficient, and that was tactically sound because as he moved to close in on the suspect, he was also motioning for people to exit behind him, which they were able to see on video. And then many people would have died last night if not for this responsible armed citizen that took action very quickly and within the first 2 minutes of this shooting. What's interesting is he actually had they said his actions would suggest him being a highly trained military operator, but he had no formal firearms training he learned from his grandfather. And then, of course, he was carrying under the new constitutional carry law that they had just enacted in Indiana. One other thing that I really like about Eli Dicken here, it's just a really cool part of this, is the media has been reaching out, obviously, and wanted to have him on and want to talk to him. And his attorney came forward and said, listen, because we want to respect the ongoing criminal investigation by the Greenwood Police Department and take time to honor the 3 innocent lives lost, we won't be making any substantive comments on the Sunday's events until the authorities' investigation is closed. In the interim, we ask that you respect the privacy of Eli and his family. How cool is that? So not only did he do this heroic act, he didn't make a media circus out of it either and wasn't seeking the limelight immediately. Now, in the future, he may talk about it, and there may be, and I hope that there is. I would like to hear more from him and more, you talk about probably one of the neatest things is learning to shoot from his grandfather. Some of this is what's lost in America. This is what we don't have, is parents teaching their kids these skills and then being able to, in a time of crisis, step up and take care of something. So that's kind of the point. And that's really where I want to end it this week is, there is this push right now for the government to take care of whatever problem you may have, right? It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what arena we're in, whatever crisis they dream up, as I've spoken about in previous weeks. It doesn't matter on any of those fronts. There's this idea that the government is going to solve your problem. And that trickles down to this idea that law enforcement is going to be able to solve whatever problem may arise. So that's why the people that are against things like the Second Amendment, which is a clearly defined God-given right, but nonetheless, those who fall on the argument that, well, people shouldn't be able to carry guns because police carry guns. Well, you can see from these 3 examples that I've given you, that if an incident is taking place, and sadly, by the time law enforcement gets there, there's a higher probability that that situation is over. And if you don't have a way to defend yourself, it probably was not positively resolved. It was probably quite negatively resolved. In other words, something bad probably happened and the bad guy either harmed themselves or they took off. We know that statistically, right? So there is this whole idea that, well, we want the government to take care of it. We want law enforcement to take care of it. No, you are the first responder. You are the person who is going to have to respond to whatever that situation is initially. And to have some sort of basic skills, some sort of basic knowledge, some sort of basic understanding of what to do when things go awry. I'm not saying you need to be a prepper. I'm not saying, in fact, I don't qualify in any way as a quote-unquote prepper or whatever term you want to throw out there. I don't think you need to have an everyday carry of, you're pulling out, multiple guns and you've got knives and you've got all these different things. But there are a few basic things that you should probably have on you. A firearm being one of them, a knife being another, a small pocket knife, the kind of thing that your grandfather would say you never leave the house without, that kind of thing. I actually do keep a tourniquet in a bag that I typically have with me when I'm in my vehicle. The reason I keep that is, to me, that is actually probably a greater risk and a higher probability in some car accidents and different things that I may come across, that tourniquet could save more lives than even the firearm could. So it's those kind of little things. I'm not saying you got to go crazy. Keep one in the car, keep one handy, but think about, you need to change your thinking, and we as a society need to change our thinking. There is, as we know, the Boy Scout motto, which I don't have much respect for Boy Scouts anymore, just the organization, not those in it. But the motto of be prepared, right? That's such a great motto, and it's so simple, but it's exactly where we're at. You need to be prepared. You need to be ready for whatever may happen. Lord forbid you're in a food court, and I think this is a good question we all need to ask ourselves, even myself included. There's some self-reflection to do here, right? So you're in a food court and an incident like this one in Indiana unfolds. Do I have the skills to do what he did? Can I neutralize this threat from 40 yards? Am I there? And if you're not, then I'd say it's time to go to the range. See, there's this mistaken idea. And listen, law enforcement are heroes. They're going to get there. They're going to help those who are vulnerable, those who are been victimized, those who can't help themselves in a lot of cases. But many times, it's a latent investigation. In other words, it's after the fact. They respond, right? They react. They get there after the fact, after it's already unfolded, and they piece it together. They're there to get the information for successful prosecution, to help those that they can, make sure that they get medical help. All those things are taking place, but what they're not necessarily able to do is deal with it in the moment. In other words, something like this shooting at the mall, if that young man would have been there, 3 to 5 minutes probably, not having any idea. I haven't looked at dispatch screens. I have no idea how far out police were. Maybe there was someone in the parking lot working on reports. But presumably, 3 to 5 minutes, 3 to 15 minutes is probably a pretty good average of how long it may have taken. Well, how many lives could have been lost in that period of time? Too many to think about, right? And the answer lies in having citizens be responsible for themselves. If you are able, if you are capable, if you are able to go through the training, if you are able to self-educate, be prepared and be ready and become your own first responder in that regard. That is the best action for society. It's the best action for you, and it'll be the best action for your family. And quite frankly, it's the best thing for law enforcement. I would much rather show up after the fact and see that a citizen saved the lives of multiple other people, and then we'll piece it together and make sure the bad guy's held responsible, and we'll call it a day. Because at the end of the day, you as a citizen of America are your own first responder. So let me leave you with 2 thoughts. First of all, don't let anybody, any government, any regime, anyone who thinks that they know better than the Constitution to take these rights away from you. You should be vehemently opposed to such things. Secondly, be as well trained as you can be. Be as knowledgeable as you can be. I'm not saying you got to be a nut. I'm not saying you got to shoot necessarily every day. I'm not saying you've got to be at the range every day. In fact, for the cost right now, I don't know how you could afford to with the price of ammunition. But we live in a great time. You can actually get those little laser sights and train on your own at your house. There's all sorts of things you can do if you decide you want to do it. So I'll leave you with that this week. I hope everyone has a great week. To those listening in law enforcement, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you have different thoughts, please be sure to reach out. We're on every major social media platform, most of them at On the Blue Line Podcast, at On the Blue Line Podcast. You can find all that information by going to the website at ontheblueline.com. Everyone have a great week and be safe out there, and I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.